Welcome to this Medicine Through Time lesson on reports, philanthropists and model towns related to the development of medicine and public health in the 19th century and early 20th century. We're going to start by having a look at a couple of sources. Here's the first one. Source A, from an internet article on old age pensions. The old age pension helped to empty the workhouses and give happiness to the old, wrote Trevelyan, a historian. Flora Thompson, who was a post office clerk, recounts that in her village there were one or two poorer couples just holding on to their homes, but in daily fear of the workhouse. When the old age pensions began, life was transformed for such aged cottagers. They were relieved of anxiety. When they went to the post office to draw it, tears of gratitude would run down the cheeks of some, and they would say, "God bless you, miss." I should point out, for those of you who are unaware, a workhouse was where the very, very poor could go in order to get very basic food and very basic lodgings in return for very hard work. In fact, workhouses were deliberately designed to be as unpleasant as possible whilst keeping the people alive, so that they deterred people from using them. Let's have a look at our second source. This is a cartoon produced in a Liberal Party leaflet of 1909. Lord Halsbury, who's shown on the right, was a recently retired Tory politician, shown with his big dog there. Notice that the dogs are both labelled. The big dog on the right is labelled pension, and the little dog on the left is labelled old age pension. Let's have a look at the text. The big dog and the little one. Lord Halsbury: "I don't think much of that paltry little thing. It's a mockery of a dog." And then the aged pensioner replies: "Well, my lord, 'tis only a little un, but 'tis a wonderful comfort to me, as bain't all blessed with big uns." Here's a do now task then. How similar are the messages of these sources? Give an example from each to support your view, and pause the video while you do this. Well, hopefully we've identified that the messages of these sources are quite similar, in fact. Source A highlights just how relieved the old age pensioners were to get a small pension. It might have been small, but it was enough to keep them out of the workhouse. Then consider the message of Source B. This also highlights the small nature of the old age pensions, but that it doesn't matter that it's small, it is just enough to keep these people out of the workhouse and provide a comfort for them. One of the stranger, if you like, objections to the old age pensions was that they were too small to be useful. But this ignores the point that many of these people were relying on other sources of income. The original old age pensions were not in fact designed to be all that anyone relied on. However, we're going to move on now to look at some of the other aspects of public health at the time, and the philanthropists, the reports that they wrote, and the model towns that were established in order to improve the health of people in general. Firstly, let's go over some key terms. In Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today are: reform, change to how things are done, often small or gradual rather than big changes. For example, the 1848 Public Health Act is a reform because it sort of tweaked the earlier arrangements. Then we have radical reform, big changes that are completely new or against existing ideas. An example of this might be the 1911 National Insurance Act. Philanthropist, a wealthy person who believes in helping others with their wealth. An example would be Seabone Roundtree, who we're going to study in this lesson. Quaker, a denomination of Christianity. Many philanthropists were Quakers, an example of this being George Cadbury. A model town or garden city. New towns planned to be pleasant, healthy and moral. Examples of these include Bourneville, built by the aforementioned George Cadbury. Okay then, record and describe each of these key terms. Why might radical reform face more opposition? And what might the opposite of radical reform be? Pause the video here while you complete these tasks. Okay, hopefully we got those down. Radical reform often faces greater opposition because, for one thing, it's quite expensive and it can seem like a big risk. Traditionally, Tories or Conservatives are against radical reform, but not always. So what might be the opposite of radical reform? Well, that might be something like moderate reform or conservatism, where you keep things the same as they were. Another thing to consider here is, if you don't know about the 1848 Public Health Act, or indeed the 1911 National Insurance Act, I do have other lessons on my channel which can help you with these terms, so give those a look first if you feel that you need to. Anyway, onwards to the reports, philanthropists and the model towns. The key focus of today is as follows. You're going to create a series of mind maps of structured notes pages detailing the contributions of significant individuals, philanthropists, and their work in relieving poverty and improving health. Often, this was simply raising awareness of the problem. You're going to include sections on the following for each of our main topics: Charles Booth, his positive poverty maps and studies of London society; Seabone Roundtree, his York study and its findings. I'll point out that Charles Booth and Seabone Roundtree are pictured on the right of your screen now. The model towns and garden cities, including the following case studies: Saltaire, Bourneville, Letchworth Garden City, and Welland Garden City. You can structure your mind maps as follows. Put the topic in the middle, for example, Seabone Roundtree, and then around the outside, these can be your subheadings. Who was involved? How did it help? When did it happen? How was it important? Who did it help? And why was it done? You might want to pause the video now while you create your templates. Remember, you're going to need 3 in total. 1 for Charles Booth, 1 for Seabone Roundtree, and 1 for the model towns and garden cities. Notice how each of my sections has got its own colour. I prefer to make my mind maps with coloured sections, which helps double encode the information into my brain and helps me to remember it. You might want to do the same thing if you've got colours available. Pause the video while you complete your templates, and then we'll move on to the content where you can do your research. We're going to start by having a look at Charles Booth's report into poverty in London. Here's a sample of one of his famous poverty maps. Notice that the buildings have been colour-coded depending on the amount of poverty in the area, or indeed the amount of wealth. The colours can be quite mixed and close to each other, showing that reasonable wealth could often live right alongside extreme poverty. Of note, we have the black areas. These show the so-called lowest class, what Booth referred to as vicious or semi-criminal. The brighter colours, like the red, those are the middle class and well-to-do areas. Again, notice how close they are. You can pause the video here and study this source in more detail, but then we're going to move on to our first section of research. We're now going to complete our first section on our mind maps. This one should be on Charles Booth. Remember to look back at the template if you need help in laying out your work. You can either listen to me read the information and make notes as we go, or you can skip to the end of this section and pause the video and take the notes for yourself. Whichever you choose, hopefully it will work for you. Charles Booth, Life and Labour of the People of London. After building his fortune in steamships trading out of London, Booth became a philanthropist and decided to devote considerable efforts and, in fact, money into investigating poverty in London. Remember from our key words earlier, a philanthropist is someone who decides to use their wealth to help others. Where there was poverty, there was often crime. Where there was crime and poverty, there was often poor health. Booth identified that often the well-off and the semi-criminal paupers often lived only a few streets away from each other, and he showed this in a series of colour-coded maps like the one we saw before. Booth published his findings between 1892 and 1897. Booth also identified what he considered to be the minimum income for a family of 4 to 5 people to survive. He introduced the idea of the poverty line. This is an idea that still exists to this day. In the 1890s, Booth identified that this was between 10 and 20 shillings income per week, 20 shillings being £1. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that was the bare minimum for a family of 4 to 5 to survive, so it would pay for things like their lodgings or rent and basic food for the week. But below that level, Booth suggested that a family of 4 or 5 people would not be able to survive. And so, below the poverty line, people would have to resort to the workhouse or criminal behaviour. The major impact of this report, other than raising awareness, was that it demonstrated how just a small amount of extra money could prevent poverty and reliance on the workhouse. This helped influence the introduction of old age pensions in 1908 and the National Insurance Act in 1911. These reforms by the Liberal government only appeared around 20 years after Booth's first findings were published. It can hardly be said that Booth's work had an immediate impact, important as it was. I remind you of our cartoons at the start of the lesson, the little dog being just enough to comfort the old man, and that being a metaphor for the small amount of money that an old age pension would provide, but how even that small amount of money would be just enough to keep you above the poverty line. So, complete the first mind map on Charles Booth, and as an extension, if you want to put it any further, what other improvements might this work lead to? Pause the video while you complete that, and then we'll move on to section number 2. Hopefully you've got the hang of the note-taking around the mind maps, or however you're choosing to record your information. We're now going to look at Seabone Roundtree, pictured. Seabone Roundtree and the York study of 1899. You might be familiar with the name. Rowntrees still produce sweets to this day, although the company has since been bought out. Well, Seabone Rowntree's father was the originator of all this, as we'll see. Roundtree was a philanthropist whose family made their fortune in the chocolate and confectionery business. Rowntree's father, Joseph, had already introduced healthcare and pension benefits for some of his workers, but Seabone Roundtree recognised that the problems extended throughout the city of York where he was based. Inspired by Booth, he conducted a survey of the poor of York, asking what they ate day by day, how much they earned, and how much each family had left over at the end of the week. He also asked about their drinking and gambling habits. As a Quaker, Roundtree was dead against this sort of behaviour, and he investigated the sanitary conditions in the streets and houses. He interviewed over 11,000 families in York and found that 27% of York's population lived below Booth's poverty line. The effect of this work was to bring about greater awareness of the problems faced by the poor. He showed that the 1875 Public Health Act, which made setting up public health boards compulsory, wasn't always effective. And, together with Booth, he showed that the poor did not choose to live in unhealthy areas, but they were trapped there by low wages. This challenged the laissez-faire attitude that the poor were responsible for being poor. Okay, by modern sensibilities, it might seem a little bit strange that anyone would accuse the poor of deliberately choosing to be poor, but at the time that was a quite common way of thinking. Your next tasks then. Complete the next mind map on Seabone Roundtree, just like the one you did before on Charles Booth. And as an extension, what other improvements might this work lead to? Pause the video while you complete your notes. What's a model town? Well, I don't mean a model village like the one being constructed in the photograph. I'm talking about one more like this. Or rather, this is the workplace in a model town. It happens to be Titus Salt's Saltaire factory. But it's not like a lot of factories you might see. For example, where are the smokestacks billowing out noxious fumes? What are all these gardens in the foreground? And what might we ask about the quality of the housing and the quality of work there? Well, this gives us an idea of what we mean by a model town. Not a miniature one, but one built to a certain model or design, one that encourages health and good living. Model towns and garden cities. It's time to complete our notes on our third and final mind map. Saltaire. Yorkshire industrialist Titus Salt, who made his money in the wool trade, was a philanthropist who decided his workers should share in his success. He built a brand new model town with a new mill for employment and excellent housing and sanitation for all who worked for him. It also boasted excellent canal and rail links. He called his new town Saltaire after himself, and it was built in 1851. This quality came at a price though. Salt's religious beliefs meant that he did not allow any pubs or other drinking establishments to be built. To this day, Saltaire is still dry, with no pubs or off licences. I visited there with my family, and when we fancied getting a pint at lunchtime, it wasn't possible, I can assure you of that. Here's a quote that helps us understand Salt's thinking. Historian David James explains why Saltaire was built, from a book published in 2004. Salt was deeply religious and sincerely believed that by creating an environment where people could lead healthy, virtuous, godly lives, he was doing God's work. Perhaps also, diffident and articulate as he was, the village may have been a way of demonstrating the extent of his wealth and power. What we really mean there is that Titus Salt might have been showing off a little bit here, but that wouldn't be a very Christian thing to do, so he did it in quite a clever way, which at least helped people. Take your first notes on our first part of the Model Towns and Garden Cities section. We're going to have a look at a couple of more examples once you're done, so pause the video here. So this is the first of 3 case studies that you'll add to your mind map. Have you got everything that you need? If so, let's move on. Here's our next case study. Bourneville. George Cadbury, yes, that Cadbury, was another Quaker philanthropist who made his fortune in, you guessed it, the chocolate industry. He decided that he would use some of his vast wealth to build a model village, which numbered some 313 houses by 1900. Like Salt, Cadbury believed that drinking and gambling were wrong, so while he built schools and churches, pubs and places of entertainment were not built. George Cadbury and Titus Salt proved that good quality facilities and housing were possible while still making money. They also believed that quality communities made people morally better people too. Few people followed their lead though, it has to be said. Alright, this is the second of our 3 case studies, so pause the video here and complete your notes on this section. Done? Let's have a look at our third part. On to our third section, on garden cities. People have often heard of these, but often don't realise quite how recently built they are. The Garden City movement. The main driving force of this movement was Ebenezer Howard. He was yet another Quaker philanthropist who decided that for people to be happy, healthy, and morally good, they had to live in nice surroundings. He saw that people were attracted to different types of place for different reasons. He used the metaphor of magnets. People were attracted to towns by the employment that was there. They were attracted to the countryside by the beauty and the fresh air. Howard believed that the garden cities could be the best of both town and country. This meant the brand new planned towns that he intended to build would have the following. Good links to major cities like London. That would have been by rail at the time. Open, green spaces within the cities, like the one pictured. Purpose-built sanitation and good quality housing. That meant proper sewers. They should be surrounded by a green belt for good quality air and to stop the towns growing too big. Ebenezer Howard bought the land and began to build the first garden city in 1899. He called it Welwyn Garden City. This style of purpose-built new town was a great success, though expensive, and it was followed by others like Letchworth Garden City in 1919. The garden cities have since inspired similar projects elsewhere in Britain, and indeed the rest of the world. So, this is the last of your 3 case studies. Add it to your mind map now. Done? Well, let's have a look at applying the knowledge. We're going to have a look at an exam-style question here now. This is based upon the Edexcel specification, or Pearson specification as it's sometimes referred to. I'm not going to give you too much help with this. In many of my other lessons, I've given lots of guidance as to how you answer these questions. So it's time to test you a little bit more. I'm only going to give you the briefest of guidance this time. Firstly, read the question carefully. Explain how philanthropists contributed to improvements in public health in the late 19th and early 20th century. 12 marks for this one here, so you're going to have to explain multiple points. In the exam, you'll also be given some stimulus material. This is just to get you going. You may use the following in your answer. The York Survey of 1899, model towns. It would also say in the exam that you must also use information of your own. Now this means that you can write about whatever you like as long as it's relevant, but you may also use the stimulus points, but you don't have to. However, it's usually a good idea to do so because you know that those are going to be relevant and credited as long as you know what they're about. Here's a bit of a tip then. You'll need 3 point, example, explain and link paragraphs. So make sure you make a point about how philanthropists have contributed to movements in public health, you give specific examples, you explain their effects, and then you link it back to the questions. How did those philanthropists help public health? You should aim to spend a maximum of around 18 minutes here unless you're entitled to extra time within your exam. So pause the video here while you complete that. We'll then look at a sample answer. Done? Okay, when we have a look at the sample answer, you might want to make some improvements. I've colour-coded my sample answer with the point, example, explain and link sentences highlighted in different colours as follows. Paragraph number 1. One way philanthropists improved public health was through raising awareness of how poverty led to poor health. For example, in the 1890s, Charles Booth conducted a study in London that demonstrated the link between poverty and poor standards of health and crime. He did this by creating maps that showed how poverty could exist alongside relative wealth, with the level of wages explaining the difference in health and well-being of these people. This improved public health by demonstrating that low wages often led to bad housing and bad health. Here's my second example. Similarly, Seabone Roundtree conducted his York study. Roundtree was a Quaker philanthropist and was partly inspired by the work of Booth. He demonstrated that in York, 27% of people were below Booth's poverty line, and many people struggled to eat a suitable diet and had poor access to clean water. This improved public health by further demonstrating the link between low wages and poor health. My third example. Lastly, some philanthropists established new towns. Another Quaker, Titus Salt, had earlier established a model town, Saltaire. Salt focused on increasing the health and well-being of his workers by building quality housing, having better working conditions and encouraging healthy lifestyles. This improved public health as it demonstrated that the towns could be built and designed to be more healthy. Okay, so I've got my three examples in, but I need to now draw them together. Here's my conclusion. The most important way that philanthropists improved public health was with their money. Philanthropists use their money to investigate, raise awareness of public health problems, and then build solutions to them. Together, these things demonstrated how public health could be improved. At a time when governments were reluctant to spend money on the poor, philanthropists contributed instead. Pause the video here, make any additions and improvements that you feel you need to, and then we'll conclude. Finally then, note down some answers to these questions. Give yourselves a few seconds for each one. What line did Charles Booth introduce in his report? What religious movement links many of these philanthropists? And give 3 ways that philanthropists and new towns improved health. Pause the video while you complete those. So the answer to question 1 should be the poverty line. The answer to question 2 should be that they were mostly Quakers. And you could choose various ways that the philanthropists improved health, along with the new towns. However, here's 3 if you are stuck. They gathered evidence of the causes of poor health, particularly related to poverty. They raised awareness of poverty and the link to low wages. And they built better quality housing, e.g. Saltaire and Bourneville. Once you got those down, that's the end of this online lesson. I hope it has been useful to you, and if it has, like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be back with more Medicine Through Time content very soon. Thanks for watching.